hamstrings. But that's not a negative. That's a very positive thing because they want to hold more tension in the hamstrings so they get more recoil. But they should have full mobility, meaning their body should be able to attain an astrograph squat, like a full depth squat. So I think that's a very important distinction for sure. So what are some of the ways that we can affect change at the joint, or create more mobile systems, right? Like a mobile home can change its location around the country. How can we gas up the home, or how can we change the tires, or create a bunch of tools that will allow us to transport our body into these different positions? So some different tools, or how do we affect mobility or mobileness change?
So with mobility, first, when we kind of talk about why do people become less mobile or less flexible in a negative way, or what we would consider not within normal limits, you look at injury, you look at overuse, you look at really challenging the body in ways that perhaps it couldn't manage, and so you'll have kind of a negative effect from that. So a hip joint might get tight or stiff for some reason, so whether it loses its flexibility or its mobility simultaneously, it's out of a response to something maybe negative that happened. One of the things we try to do to correct that is we try to bring heat and friction to the joint, which is by warming up. You guys have all talked about dynamic warm-up and the difference between the different kinds of stretching, ballistic stretching and isometric stretching and dynamic stretching. That helps prep tissue to encourage and influence mobility and flexibility simultaneously. So that kind of global warm-up we love. That's a tool that we use a lot for any kind of training or preparatory work. And then, of course, we have devices now that we are coming out with. I mean, there's everything from foam rollers to peanuts to trigger point to, I guess calf massagers, you guys name it. And so those are ways that we can help self-mobilize, right? We target specific areas that we feel are tight or tense or stiff or are painful, and we address those with that. And then there's other, practitioners, let's say like massage therapists or ART or ROSTI specialists, where now we tackle tissue from a very aggressive manual way. So with somebody else's hands trying to kind of manage the tissue, bring heat and blood flow to the area, and then improve the range or improve the mobility by specific movement patterns after they have done work to the muscles and the joint capsule that's around it. So there's a lot of ways that we can do it by ourselves or with a specific tool, or then we borrow someone else's hands, like a massage therapist, to kind of help influence that from a perspective of tools.
Cool. So, I mean, we could say, I guess, that we're trying to affect change at these different levels. There's one, the tissue level. There's another that's actually the joint, like the capsule of the joint, and then maybe the muscle fiber tension, which is affecting, as we said, the flexibility, the extensibility of the muscle. So let's kind of talk about each of those modalities, because I think that when tissue work is being done, especially now with using lacrosse balls and all these sort of things that you and I love to repurpose and invent with. My favorite thing that CP has inspired me with is in the development of her system, she's developing this wand, which basically looks like a baton that you can really do some really cool things with. And it is it's just funny how we love to take these things and find better ways to get inside our tissues. Like I took two softballs and taped them together, and I call it a crazy 8 because it looks like a huge 8 ball, and it works like crazy, and it feels crazy when you get it between your upper shoulder blades. But what are we actually doing when we, put a lacrosse ball into a tissue, or, someone puts their fingers into the tissue? Because really it's the same thing, just you're trying to do it for yourself. So what changes are we doing? What systems are we working on? Like connective tissues, fascia? What are we really doing there?
Yeah, when we start to try and tackle self-mobilization, whether we're using a lacrosse ball or the wand, for instance, basically tissue responds to pressure. I'm sure people have heard of acupressure, acupoints, trigger point, areas of tissue that become toned. Toned is a term that we use a lot in the medical community when a normal person might call it, or a lay person might call it feeling tight. We call it toned when basically it feels like it's kind of contracting when you're in a relaxed state. That tends to make people uncomfortable. It's irritating to the surrounding tissues and the joints. That can have a fascial component to it. The fascia meaning that kind of thick white tissue that covers muscles and really becomes kind of bound. So you've got this tone where the muscle's sort of contracting, and then you've got this bound fascia. It literally, when you look at it in like under an electron microscope, it looks like everything's kind of crosshatched and disorganized and knotted up, just like a yo-yo would if you recoil it. It just kind of it coils back up on itself, and so tissue does that as well. So what we try to do with, say, somebody's thumb or an elbow or a lacrosse ball or a softball or the wand now is literally target that area and then create movement around it. So you basically could knead the dough, if you will, right? You take a rolling pin and you get the lumps out of your cookie dough. It's kind of the same thing. You want to kind of smooth out whether it's the muscular tissue, the fascia, or some scar. Sometimes there's like adhesions or scarring that's occurred in an area, and you're literally trying to manipulate that in a way that you can, and it usually takes pressure, deep pressure, to do that. It's a lot of times why people feel like that's a bittersweet thing. It hurts so good, Yeah. And so with the wand, one of the reasons we developed that was because there was no way for people to really pin something like, let's say, in the pectoral muscle, right, in the chest, and be able to also move their arm in a variety of motions without being in a weird position against the ground or against the wall. But when you don't have something like that and you're just using the lacrosse ball, there's a way that you can pin whatever tissue you're working on and then create movement around that. And so again, you're just trying to take that lump in your cookie dough, smooth it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really, a good way of, I guess, putting it. But, you say there that, I like the analogy of rolling up the yo-yo. I think that's really cool. So when we're using our muscles, we're constantly going to be getting that yo-yo back and forth, rolling up. So there will be a natural amount of, build up, I'm sure, of fascia and tissue, and kind of like a little bit of the cross section, getting all twisted, right, in the fascia. But really, and that's, I think, where athletes need to constantly understand that, once you resolve maybe a chronic problem, that you still need to do that maintenance, because you're doing a lot of cycles, right? Like you're putting your body through a lot. But there will be a natural amount, but it's when we see that unnatural amount that we know that something else is, I think, going on behind the scenes. But how else could we maybe change from the joint perspective? Because I know that traction has become, or actually I should say, I guess Kelly calls it distraction, and he's now made distraction a coinable word. How do we do that at the joint, and how does that affect our tissues, or maybe the nerves, or some of the other things that we do?
Yeah, distraction is just a more, I guess, a broad term that kind of describes us taking, let's say we're talking about the hip. We take the femur and kind of separate it from the acetabulum. So you kind of take the puzzle pieces and kind of give them some space. When you give them some space, whether you're using a stretch band to do it or someone's hands, a lot of times in therapy we use it, or chiropractors use it. You basically, do kind of trigger the nervous system to relax a little bit. And also, if you think about, we're very gravity dependent creatures, so things basically kind of compress on each other. It's a nice way to just unload the joint. It also brings typically some kind of fluid. We call it synovial fluid in the medical world, but in general, we're just talking about the lotion or the lubricant that manages joints. A lot of times that gets very stagnant, thickened, which causes irritation in joint, pain or irritation, I guess you could say. And so by distracting the joint, you kind of alter that environment. You create some movement where that fluid can flow now a little more freely. And then also by distracting or creating traction on the joint, once the nervous system is relaxed, now you have access to moving the joint capsule, that thing I talked about earlier. It's a big fascial sheath that really, really responds to low load, long duration things, which means we kind of we sweet talk it, if you will, kind of for a length of time. You're just kind of trying to ease into something so that now you can have further access to the joint, again, which will then always result in you having access to the muscles later. So we're talking about all of those tissues again, only now we're getting a little deeper into the lubricant of the joint, and by distracting or tracting or creating traction in something, you get access to that system.
So is that also, by moving the joint away a little, creating that space, is that also why when you do a stretch in the presence of a distraction, that you get more movement in the muscle? The muscle tends to relax more because, muscles cross joints, and if you're opening up the joint, one side of the muscle might be pinned in, right? The tendon could be pinned. So when you're opening that up, is that the reason why you see more of that space, that more openness, where it seems like the stretch is getting deeper, but really that you're unpinning the muscle?
Yeah, absolutely, that can happen. And I think you just get a different response when you attack things from the joint perspective. All of the mechanoreceptors and the neurological components of that are also affected. Unlike a muscle, where you're dealing with the tendon and the muscle fibers, once you manage the joint, you get access to all of that, and therefore you get a deeper response from a flexibility perspective and from a mobility perspective because of that. So by distracting that joint, you can absolutely expose whether you were pinned or sometimes it's even just that you've got that tone like we were talking about, and it allows the tone to relax a little bit so the muscle can relax, so then you have access to stretching it. So it's kind of all of those things, especially in areas of like the hip and the shoulder where you really do get muscles that kind of get bound and pinched, if you will. Yeah.
Well, with that, talk to me a little bit about this creation you've dreamed up in Mobo. I've actually had the privilege to demo it, and I loved it. And I actually did a segment for you recommending it in the way that I train athletes. I think it's a really cool tool. I literally have a trunk in my car that is filled when I go and train the Austin Aztecs soccer team. Our pro soccer team here in Aztecs, in Austin. I have 5 Home Depot buckets full of various lacrosse balls, 2 lacrosse balls taped together called the Peanut, softballs, 2 softballs taped together, bands, rope. I mean, it goes on, and and you showed me this sort of one product that has them all together, and it just kind of blew me away. So talk to me about the evolution of it, about the components of it. I'm excited about it, so I just want to learn more about it.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we're in the production phase of it now. So we called it Mobo just because, that's a little play on words with mobility, and we call it the Mobo system because it truly is. I think what happened was I was in the clinic and I was getting frustrated as a therapist because I really wanted tools for my patients to be able to go home and work on certain things, and there are just not a lot of tools out there that can really get into certain areas that I see probably the most from my athletes in the clinic. And so I started trying to kind of dream up some of those, and that's kind of where it started. But then I would go into a gym, or I would go to a competition. I would see somebody like you with a trunk full of stuff, and I thought, man, there has to be a way that we could put it all together. And it kind of reminded me of a Swiss Army knife. You know, it's not just a knife anymore. It's like a freaking toothpick and tweezers and scissors and a screwdriver. I mean, are you kidding me? Everything's in that thing. And so I thought there's got to be a way that we could create a tool where you could kind of take it apart, put it together, make it modular, so that if you needed a small ball, you had a small ball. If you need two balls together, you can